Thank you. So it's a really enormous honor to be here before you today uh, and to hear the testimony of my fellow panelists. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this process. So my testimony today will cover two major topics. First, the existence of slavery in California, uh, and the experiences of enslaved Black people. And then I will also talk about the role that California's early lawmakers and judges played in protecting slavery and promoting anti-Black oppression in the state of California. So the existence of slavery in California seems puzzling to a lot of people at first. Famously, California was supposed to be a free state with an anti-slavery constitution. It entered the federal union as part of the Compromise of 1850, this brokered political deal aimed at appeasing both pro and anti-slavery Americans. Yet at the same time, there's ample evidence that the enslavement of people of African descent happened in California. And what is more, California's early state government protected the institution of slavery and severely restricted Black people's civil rights. And I'm going to aim to explain this kind of disconnect today. So one of the key reasons that the state of California tolerated slavery was that the enslavement of Black people had already taken root before the drafting of the anti-slavery Constitution in 1849. California had been part of Mexico before the United States seized it in the US-Mexico War, which went from 1846 to 1848. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, but American slaveholders began forcibly bringing enslaved Black people into California before, during, and after the US-Mexico War, especially once the gold rush began in 1848. The exact number of enslaved Black people in California is difficult to determine. My detailed analysis of census records reveals approximately 203 enslaved Black people living in California in 1850 and approximately 178 in 1852. These are almost certainly undercounts because Gold Rush census records are notoriously incomplete. Given the fragmented records, I support the findings of a historian named Rudolph Lapp, who estimated that at least 500 to 600 enslaved Black people lived in California during the gold rush. Now, each of these enslaved people almost certainly suffered traumatic uprooting. Going to California meant a forced separation from family, friends, and community by a distance of thousands of miles. And even though slaveholders framed this separation as temporary, most gold seekers spent at least 2 years in California and usually many more years due to the distance and difficulty of the journey. For an example, an enslaved North Carolina man, who is known only as John, arrived in California with slaveholder Robert M. Dixon in 1852 and stayed at least 3 years until Dixon's sudden death in 1855. The historical record is silent about whether John ever returned to North Carolina. His journey to California may have resulted in permanent separation from his family. Now, like John, most of the enslaved people forced to migrate to California were younger men or teenaged boys who ended up working as miners in the gold country. These enslaved miners faced backbreaking and often dangerous working conditions. Placer mining, which was the most common type of mining in the earliest days of the gold rush, involved digging up soil from the beds and banks of rivers and creeks. Sometimes miners dammed up and diverted these bodies of water to get at gold deposits deep in the beds. These techniques often required standing knee-deep or waist-deep in cold rushing water for several hours each day in the broiling summer heat. Overwork, exposure to the elements, poor sanitation, a lack of nutritious food, and the absence of medical care contributed to long-term illnesses or death by disease. For instance, several enslaved men from western North Carolina died in a cholera epidemic along with their enslaver in Tuolumne County in 1852. Accidents and injuries were also common, and we can see that in the life of an enslaved man from Kentucky known only as Reuben. Reuben died in the American River. He drowned in the American River while working in the gold country in 1851. Now, not all enslaved people worked directly in mining. Women and girls who made up less than 1/4 of all recorded enslaved people in California often labored as domestic servants, cooks, or laundresses in private homes, hotels, restaurants, or boarding houses. Skilled domestic workers, in fact, were so scarce and their wages were so high that slaveholders often rented both enslaved women and men to the owners of these establishments. And this practice was called hiring out. Slaveholders then pocketed all or most of the enslaved people's wages from their rented labor. So much like the enslaved people in the U.S. South, those in California also faced brutal violence. In 1850, one slaveholder beat an enslaved man in the town square of San Jose for disobeying him. Local authorities arrested both men, but ultimately determined that the slaveholder was not guilty of assault because his victim was legally his slave. In another case from 1850, an elderly enslaved couple ran away near the town of Sonora. When the slaveholder caught them, he whipped the elderly man until his blood flowed so heavily that it filled his shoes. One of the worst incidents of violence also happened in 1850, this time in Los Angeles. A group of white Southerners chased, shot at, and captured a handful of escaped enslaved people, and then beat them until one nearly died. The forced journey to California resulted in diverse outcomes for the enslaved people who survived it. Many people probably worked in California for a few years before returning to enslavement in the South. Others, especially those who were allowed to keep a small portion of their wages from hiring out or from digging gold, saved enough money to purchase their freedom. And finally, some enslaved people labored under formal or informal indenture agreements by which they promised to work for a certain number of years in California in exchange for their freedom. Enslaved people who gained their own freedom might then also earn enough money eventually to free their family members. Now, of course, many enslaved people also saw California as a place where they could seize their own freedom or renegotiate the terms of their enslavement. The California Gold Country was large, isolated, and full of diverse people, including anti-slavery Black and white Northerners. It was generally far easier to run away, hide, and find allies in California than it was in the southern slave states. But it's important to remember, and I really always emphasize this, that all enslaved people who went west were forced to leave their family members and communities behind in the South. Escape, therefore, was not a viable option for many enslaved people because staying with slaveholders was their only way to maintain their family ties most of the time. Slaveholders, in effect, used their control over enslaved people's family members as leverage to force them to cooperate in California. And for this reason, enslaved people may have been more likely to resist in other ways. Some, for instance, refused to work or escaped temporarily until they were allowed to keep more of their earnings. And this may have been a more secure path to freedom if they earned enough to buy themselves and their family members out of slavery. Now, California's 1849 anti-slavery state constitution did little to stop the violence and exploitation that enslaved people suffered. The new constitution proclaimed that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crimes, shall ever be tolerated in this state, end quote. The problem was that slavery already existed in the state and was already being tolerated there. Furthermore, the Constitution was silent about what should happen to enslaved people in the state. It was one thing for the California Constitution to declare that slavery would not be tolerated. It was quite another thing actually to criminalize slavery, emancipate enslaved people, punish slaveholders, and give Black people protections for their freedoms. Pro-slavery white Southerners took advantage of this discrepancy to perpetuate slavery in California. During California's 1849 Constitutional Convention, pro-slavery delegates from the South had quietly accepted a pro-slavery provision banning slavery without protest or discussion. After statehood, however, a disproportionately large number of pro-slavery men won political office in California. White Southerners with pro-slavery views were prominent in the state legislature, the state courts, including the state Supreme Court, and among California's representatives in Congress. During the 1850s, these men used their newfound power to commit the state of California to protecting slaveholders' rights by passing and upholding laws that skirted around the anti-slavery Constitution. The California government's most pro-slavery action was passing and enforcing a state fugitive slave law in 1852. Pro-slavery Southerners were angry to discover that the federal fugitive slave law of 1850, which was this really harsh new law to help slave catchers chase down and re-enslave people who ran away, did not apply to most cases in California. Slaveholders could only use the federal law to catch and re-enslave people who escaped across state lines, not those who ran away within the state's borders. In 1852, the California state legislature addressed this issue by greatly expanding the definition of who counted as a fugitive slave. California's new state law defined a fugitive slave as any enslaved person who arrived in the state prior to official statehood in September 1850, but who refused to return to the slave states with their enslaver. These people were subject to arrest and deportation back to the U.S. South. Now, the legal rationale for this law was that California's anti-slavery constitution did not officially go into force until the moment of statehood. Before then, California was a California was a federal territory. California was a federal territory where, according to pro-slavery legal theory, the U.S. Constitution entitled all citizens to migrate freely with any type of property they might own, including property in human beings. Therefore, the law's supporters argued that California had a constitutional duty to protect the rights of slaveholders who arrived before official statehood. Now, the passage of this fugitive slave law made California an outlier among free states. I think that's a really important thing to understand. In the northeastern United States, places like New England, many free states resisted helping capture fugitive slaves. The California Fugitive Slave Law of 1852, on the other hand, authorized slaveholders to use violent means to capture enslaved people. It also ordered state officials to assist in the capture and arrest of enslaved people, or they would face removal from office and heavy fines. Finally, the California Fugitive Slave Law, like the federal version, strictly prohibited accused fugitives from testifying in their own defense. California also already had laws banning non-white testimony in court cases involving white people, and these laws compounded this injustice. Free Black activists, who were enslaved people's greatest allies, could not be witnesses in any court proceedings. Only so-called redeeming feature of the California Fugitive Slave Law was its short enforcement period. Slaveholders were supposed to have just 1 year to arrest and deport people who they claimed were runaway slaves. But in 1853, California legislators renewed the fugitive slave law for another year. They did the same thing again in 1854. This meant that for 3 years, from 1852 to 1855, anyone accused of being a fugitive slave could be chased down, dragged before a court, and sent back to lifelong slavery in the South, even if they had been living in the free state of California for 5 years or more. Now, just a few months after the passage of the state fugitive slave law, free Black activists, with the assistance of white attorneys, brought a test case called In Re Perkins all the way to the California Supreme Court. The state's Supreme Court justices decided that 3 Black men, Carter Perkins, Robert Perkins, and Sandy Jones, should be returned to enslavement in Mississippi because they had arrived with their enslaver before official statehood. The court ruled that the anti-slavery section of the California Constitution was only a, quote, declaration of a principle, end quote. The Constitution said the state would not tolerate slavery, but California had no laws in place to enforce this decree. So the justices also agreed with the state legislature that California could not emancipate enslaved people who arrived before official statehood. The court accepted that extreme pro-slavery legal theory that the U.S. Constitution guaranteed slaveholders the right to bring enslaved people into the federal territories without restrictions. So this decision by the California Supreme Court foreshadowed the ruling in the much more famous case of Dred Scott versus Sandford 5 years later in 1857. In that landmark decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not close slavery out of any of the federal territories. Altogether, California courts tried at least 10 cases involving the freedom of 13 people under this state fugitive slave law between the years of 1852 and 1855. In 5 of those 10 cases, the courts returned the accused runaways, 7 people total, to slavery. These numbers may seem small, but this list only includes cases for which documentation still exists. These numbers also do not accurately reflect the terror that all Black people, free or enslaved, would have suffered under this law. When combined with the exclusion of Black court testimony against whites, the California fugitive slave law made every Black person vulnerable to being accused, arrested, or deported without being able to defend themselves. Finally, it's also important to note the symbolic and political significance of the California fugitive slave law. In supporting this law, the California legislature and courts signaled their sympathy with the Southern slave states and pro-slavery interpretations of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the California legislature finally let the state fugitive slave law lapse in 1855, but fugitive slave cases continued. At least 6 additional cases involving the freedom of 19 people came before the California courts after 1855. All of these cases did eventually lead to the freedom of the enslaved people in question. But in one particular case, that of Archie Lee, which happened in 1857 through 1858, the pro-slavery California Supreme Court made every effort to return the person to enslavement. Lee's enslaver had brought the enslaved man to California years after statehood and the lapse of the fugitive slave law. Still, the justices ruled that the man who claimed ownership of Archie Lee was so young, ill, and ignorant of California's laws that he should not be punished by being deprived of his human property. It took multiple lawsuits by free Black Californians and intervention by federal legal officials to secure Archie Lee's freedom. Now, throughout the 1850s, California's political leaders were also complicit in other types of anti-Black legislation. California's 1849 Constitutional Convention delegates restricted the right to vote to white male citizens, and they also debated a Black exclusion law to prohibit all future African American migration to the state. The Black exclusion law did not make it into the Constitution, but at the urging of Peter Burnett, California's first governor, the legislature attempted to pass a Black exclusion law 4 times in the 1850s. And in addition to barring Black court testimony against whites, the California legislature also prohibited interracial marriage between Black and white people, excluded Black people from making homestead claims in the state courts, denied state funding for Black children to attend public schools, and refused to acknowledge petitions from Black activists seeking to change these unjust laws. The vicious anti-Black tone of state politics prompted many Black Californians to leave the state in search of greater freedom and equality. Starting in 1858, up to 800 Black men, women, and children migrated north to the colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia, where many became British subjects. Now, the Civil War and Reconstruction brought important victories and bitter defeats for California's Black activists. In 1863, after 12 years of petitioning, activists finally convinced the California state legislature, which was now dominated by anti-slavery Republicans, to repeal the ban on African American court testimony against whites. The late 1860s, however, saw the return of anti-Black legislation. Hostile Democrats retook the legislature and refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, establishing Black citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment, prohibiting racial discrimination against voters. California would not ratify these critical pieces of legislation until almost a century later during the Civil Rights Movement. In the meantime, California Supreme Court set another destructive precedent that the rest of the nation would eventually follow. In the 1874 case of Ward v. Flood, California Supreme Court justices ruled that segregation in the state's public schools was legal so long as Black children and white children had equal access to similar educational facilities. 22 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court adopted a similar, quote-unquote, separate but equal principle in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This famous decision upheld the segregation of public facilities in the United States for almost 60 years. As with many things, California was ahead of its time, but in this case, tragically, the state led the way in establishing anti-Black racial oppression across the United States. So in closing, I'd just like to say a little bit about my reasons for testifying today. I am a white American who, like a large number of white Americans, is descended from slaveholders. The 1830 U.S. Census shows that one of my ancestors, Arthur Jernigan of Tennessee, owned and claimed as his property 7 human beings. These enslaved people were likely a family group made up of parents and children, but we'll never know for sure because the census has no information about them, not even their names. The 1840 census showed that the Jernigans, my ancestors, no longer owned enslaved people. And while it's possible that my ancestor set these people free, the more likely horrible reality is that he sold them off to pay debts or to buy land. If so, he probably did not sell them as a family group, but as individuals, ensuring that they were separated from their loved ones forever. As a white person from an upper middle class family, I recognize that the privileges I have benefited from, economic security, access to higher education, and even my own bodily safety, are built on the stolen intellect, labor, and skills of enslaved people who my ancestors traumatically ripped away from their homes and families. For me, reparations means that white people like myself need to acknowledge not just the national debt that the United States owes to Black people for building the economic, social, and cultural foundations of this country. Reparations also entail a really deeply personal process of reflection about how to compensate Black Americans for the generational wealth and social upward mobility that white families like my own have gained from the exploitation and attempted destruction of Black families. I hope that my testimony today can help the state of California and all Californians grapple with these difficult questions. Thank you.